Welcome back. Over my series that I developed so far, I realized that I didn't have the chance to talk about Active Directory. And this is kind of like an intentional and unintentional omission at the same time. The problem is that it's a very complicated topic and it's also hard to demo because you need to have a dedicated Active Directory environment where to demo specific attacks. It requires time to set up a lab to test multiple vulnerabilities, and there are multiple paid platforms, but not a lot of free alternatives. So I kind of had a hard time finding some solutions until I decided to come up with some basic virtualization demo. I basically developed a domain controller in VMware Fusion and a Kali machine representing our attacker that's connected to the same network, kind of like an assumed breach scenario. And that's the way we normally operate because we normally are connected to the client's network as if we breached into that. So the first attack I want to demo here in this video is the so-called SRAP roasting that has to do with Kerberos authentication. Now, Kerberos is the way users are authenticated in Active Directory in a Windows environment. Basically, the authentication server, or AS, runs this Kerberos service or key distribution center, or KDC, that practically grants tickets for a request coming from a domain user. So in other words, when a user needs access to a resource, they start the Kerberos authentication process by sending a so-called SRAC or authentication server request message to the domain controller. And this message contains a timestamp encrypted with the hash of the user's password. So if the DC can decrypt the timestamp using its own copy of the user's password hash, it will send back an authentication server response, or SRAP, message that contains a ticket granted ticket issued by the key distribution center that can be used by the user for future access to other resources. So basically, the TGT is like a wristband that you get when you go to the state fairgrounds, for example, and you buy an admittance ticket, and with that ticket you get a wristband that allows you to buy services within the fair, for example a beer or a hot dog. So when you show the wristband, which is the TGT, to the vendors, in there they give you TGS, so ticket granted service, a ticket that allows you to request services from the server, basically. Now, normally this requires Kerberos pre-authentication, but this mechanism of pre-authentication can be disabled in Windows Server. So if that happens, an attacker could request authentication data for any user, and the DC will return an SRAP message. So practically the DC won't check for the authenticity of the request, so it doesn't check whether the user is who is supposed to be or not. And since the timestamp of the message, which contains the user's password hash, is attached to the message itself, the attacker can try and brute force the user password offline, and this is a way to gain a foothold on an internal network. So the default is to require Kerberos pre-authentication, but it can be disabled in Active Directory by checking a specific flag. Here we see Active Directory users and computers. That's what we need here. And if we go and check our users, we have multiple users. Now the normal configuration is the one that I'm going to show you in a little bit. The rule is to require Kerberos pre-authentication. Whenever we check this flag, it's not going to be required. So this makes the account for which this setting is enabled vulnerable to SRAP roasting. So I have a specific user that I enabled for the purposes of this attack, just to show you the way it works. You see that I checked this flag, so this account won't require Kerberos pre-authentication. Now we know all this. Now the question is, how do we get to exploit this vulnerability? You can do it in multiple ways depending on whether you have access to Windows or not. Consider the normal case where we're running a Kali virtual machine from outside the domain, even though we're connected to it somehow. So an assumed bridge scenario. I've got here a Kali machine, and this Kali machine has a series of scripts that we can use for this purpose. And connect to the domain controller, and this is where I performed an NS lookup on the domain. My demo domain is called hacking.testlab. If you don't have available a Windows machine, we can run a script from the Impacted suite called get np users, where np stands for no pre-authentication. So we can do something like that. Of course, this is an assumed bridge scenario, so we assume here we already went through a recon stage where we found valid usernames, enumerated the password policy, and so on and so forth. So this is a Python script that takes multiple arguments. The first one is the list of valid users enumerated previously. Then we can output them in an hashcat compatible format to an output file. To a specific directory. So you see that 3 or 4 users that we have on the domain controller respond with this error, which means they require re-authentication. We also see that the 4th one didn't issue such an error message, so we should assume that our attack was successful. In fact, we were successful, and this is the hash that's related to the user's password hash that was used to sign the timestamp. So now we could use this password to progress in our attack chain and conduct more attacks requiring authentication, like Kerberoasting, for example. Now there's a main difference between srap roasting and Kerberoasting, though, that srap roasting leverages a misconfiguration. In other words, a specific setting which is basically this flag here. It shouldn't be set up this way. If we set an account this way, we make it vulnerable to the srap roast attack, because the authentication server doesn't check whether the user is really who they claim to be or not. On the other hand, the Kerberoasting attack leverages a built-in Windows functionality connected with the Kerberos authentication, so it's not a vulnerability but a feature of Windows. So now that we have a password that we can pretty much crack, if we gain access to the plaintext password, we can perform multiple other attacks requiring valid authentication to the domain, but I'm going to show you this in other videos. Bye bye.